Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of the Walter's World podcast series from Astadia. My name is Walter Sweat, and I am the Astadia CTO. And today I am extremely happy to be joined once again by my good friend Bob Ellsworth, the recently retired head of the mainframe migration practice for Microsoft, and now president of Mainframe Transformation Consulting. Bob, as always, it is so good to see you, and thank you again for joining us on the podcast series.
Well, Walter, thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's been a pleasure, working with you over all these years, and also doing some of the podcasts in the past. Really looking forward to this one. And I must say, in addition, you've had several great podcasts with some very esteemed colleagues. One of those is Jim Dugan. And I did want to recognize Jim. He's an expert at Microsoft in the federal space, part of the Azure Global Engineering team, and he helped confirm a lot of the information that I had in preparation for this conversation.
Jim's a great guy, and he knows that federal space well. And in case people don't know, that is going to be the topic that we're going to focus on today. We are seeing so much activity right now here at Astadia with local, state, federal government, and the roles that they're looking to fill as they consider alternatives for their mainframe. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, Bob. Just as Jim did, you have a great deal of experience and knowledge of the federal and local and state federal government. And I think it will be helpful for our audience to kind of learn from some of your experiences. So if you're okay with that, we'll just go ahead and get started.
Sounds perfect. Look forward to it.
Thank you very much. But I'd kind of like to start out talking about the difference in government versus private sector. Do you feel that there are any differences in options for public versus private sector organizations as they look at alternatives for their mainframe?
Yeah, there definitely are some differences in what options the customers or the agencies can pursue. And it really has to do with the requirements to have, for some agencies, to have a US-based company do this work or provide this technology. So within public sector in the US, that requirement for US-based technology and SI partners really does limit the partners that you may consider engaging with. And I'll give a few examples of that. In particular, if that partner does the work offshore, then it's one that isn't eligible to do work in some of the agencies. A good example is for rehosting. Raincoat is a great example, based in Europe. For refactoring, Blue Age, has part of AWS, has workers and teams that are not in the US. From Google, Cornerstone, which is now G4, has a similar situation. And most recently, Avanade, which acquired a Cisco in Europe, in Amsterdam. It also may be limited in their ability to engage with customers. That's more on the technology side. In addition, systems integrators, if they're non-US systems integrators, or they have teams doing factory work for mainframe migration outside of the US, then those would also be limited in their ability to engage and support federal and state and local government customers.
That certainly makes sense, and it is something that those organizations have to take into account. Bob, we're at an interesting time right now. The last couple of years with COVID have certainly impacted everyone. I'm interested in your thoughts about how has COVID affected the governmental agencies? Do you feel that has been different than any of the other organizations that are out there?
Well, in particular, COVID has affected companies and agencies, across the board, with the need for employees to be able to work remotely instead of come into the office, into a central location. And in the commercial sector, they seem to adjust pretty well to remote workers and supporting remote workers. And they had systems in place to be able to do that in a lot of cases. Within the government section, that's been a bit more of a challenge. There's requirements, for example, in the Defense Department, that workers need to be, in the office, cannot work remotely. And so, having remote workers has been a real challenge for several agencies. In particular, if your systems weren't set up to access those systems securely from a remote location, you can absolutely be impacted. And so that's causing agencies to invest in surrounding technologies to surround the mainframe, or other agencies to invest in migrating workloads so they're more accessible to remote workers.
That absolutely makes sense. Bob, what are some of the other factors that governmental agencies historically have evaluated as they consider these alternatives from your perspective?
Now, one of the areas that we typically see customers factors, business reasons the customers and agencies will consider doing a migration, historically been skill shortage has been a real big one, agility, the ability to update applications quickly for changes that are required, in addition to the desire to move things to the cloud. But one of the biggest factors historically has been cost savings. And what I found in historically in federal agencies, cost savings is not a big priority. But we're seeing more and more that even within federal government agencies, cost savings, reducing cost has become a strategic initiative for some of those agencies. And especially when funding programs are available that you require to pay back the costs from the savings that you have. So then cost savings become an integral part of utilizing the funding programs.
We at Astadia are certainly seeing more and more of that as well. So it goes hand in hand with what you've been saying.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about funding, do you have any knowledge or information you can share about any funding capabilities that may exist that some organizations may not be aware of that you've seen other organizations use?
Yeah, certainly. And for federal agencies, in particular the civilian side, there's an amazing set of funding that's available for doing improving security, for modernizing applications, and for migrating off the mainframe. And that's called the Technology Modernization Fund. If you haven't looked at it, it's at tmf.cio.gov. And this has been funded by an annual budget, I think 175 million, that was established back in 2017, and then was rehydrated with $1 billion from the American Rescue Plan.
Wow.
So those funds are readily available. There is a requirement, again, to pay back those funds in some cases for mainframe modernization, mainframe migration. And that's where being able to get a good return on investment, reducing your costs over time, but having the budget, not having to go through a budget cycle to get the funds, simply being able to submit a request and be approved for the funding is a great way to accelerate these migration programs.
We all know how hard it can be to go through that funding cycle and get through it. So having
Certainly.
that as an avenue has just had to have opened up so much flexibility for people.
Certainly has. Yeah, we've seen many more agencies that want to take advantage, want to address their challenges through mainframe modernization, but didn't have the funds for it, and are taking advantage of these funding programs to be able to accelerate those decisions.
Of course. Bob, I think we always end up talking about security, but I'm curious about your thoughts about, especially in the public sector, are there special concerns that you feel organizations need to be aware of that perhaps in the private sector they might not?
Yeah, well, there's definitely some commonalities between federal organizations, public sector, and private sector. There's very similar security requirements, no matter what industry a customer's in, and that security means securing data, access to data, securing access to the applications. So very similar in the requirements for most agencies. But then there's a higher level of security, as the agencies very well know, higher level of security required where there's very confidential information, confidential data. One of the agencies I worked at when I first joined AMDAL, competing against IBM in DC in '77, was the CIA. And it was definitely drilled into you how important the securing that information that the CIA held was. So high security environments such as the CIA or NSA or FBI or DoD, that is an additional level of requirements that you could run into. And so, yes, there is some cases where higher security is required, depending on confidentiality of information. But in a lot of cases, the same sort of security that a commercial customer would need are needed in the federal space.
That makes sense. I'm curious, would you agree that the cloud providers, the major cloud providers, have done a good job in being able to help by providing security levels that kind of address some of those components that you talked about. That's what I'm seeing. Do you see it the same?
Yeah, I certainly do. It's actually pretty amazing how security is built in to the cloud solutions, and it was really designed from the very beginning. And so things like authenticating users using in the Windows environment or Azure environment, Active Directory is a typical way to ensure access to certain applications to only authorized users. The ability to secure data and encrypt it, not only when it's at rest in the cloud, but also while it's in transit. Those are standard services that are provided by the cloud solutions.
Yeah, if someone's having to invent that on their own, that's obviously a lot more difficult.
Absolutely.
Let's talk for a second about the application side. One of the things, and you talked before about how cost used to not be a factor, but it's more of a factor now. But what about agility in applications? Do you find that in government today, there is a bigger need to be able to respond to changing regulations in a quicker fashion? Is that something that is now commonplace, in your opinion?
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think that going back to COVID, I think COVID really brought it to light even more, the difficulty of changing existing systems to implement new federal regulations. A couple examples of that I'm sure that several agencies that might watch this webinar were involved in themselves are for example, the sending out of checks as part of the COVID relief funds. And it was magical and amazing that that was done as quickly as it was.
It truly was.
Since these are pretty much legacy systems, but also the ability to update systems for things like unemployment insurance. And with the federal changes or additional funds that were provided, each state then having to implement those changes in their systems, as we all saw in the press, caused some real challenges and difficulty. And it really has to do with that, legacy systems, application development done in a waterfall process, development process, instead of an agile DevOps kind of process as you do with modern applications today. So I think it definitely has been a problem all along, but it really came to light very visibly to the outsiders because of the challenges that several agencies faced.
Makes sense. Bob, I want to ask you to name the actual federal departments, but I'm curious, from your time at Microsoft, could you kind of share some information about the sizes of the mainframes that organizations were making use of, that when you talked to them, they were starting to consider alternatives? And did that size change over time?
Yeah, certainly. When I started the mainframe practice at Microsoft in 2008, just the ability of the technology, limited, or the scalability of the technology used in those days, you really limited how large a mainframe workload could be rehosted or refactored. The advances in technology and addressing scalability issues has absolutely expanded the opportunities of customers, even the largest customers, to consider migrating workloads off the mainframe. And so when you think of, so there was limitations in the technology that would limit, customers' interest because they knew their systems were just too big. But today, technologies, if you look at an LPAR on a Z series, the ability to migrate, almost any size LPAR because of the advancements in technology is absolutely there. And with federal departments that I engage with, there were customers with as little as 100 MIPS, so very, very small, and customers as large as 150,000 MIPS that were most recently considering mainframe migrations. The other thing that's fascinating, and those that are listening in from state and local government, many states, in fact, most states have a shared organization, shared service that manages a mainframe for multiple agencies. And while each agency may have a small workload, 100 MIPS, 150 MIPS, 200 MIPS, typically they're aggregated together on those mainframes that are provided by a shared service. So in those environments, to really get the benefit of a migration, all agencies need to be involved. So you don't have the last agency standing on the mainframe that has to absorb the cost of the entire mainframe as other agencies move off. So that does cause a certain behavior to ensure that everybody can participate in the planning of doing a mainframe migration.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that before, where you didn't want to be the very last agency or department having to foot that bill, without a doubt.
Absolutely. Well, it's a lot like being in college and your roommate's moving out and then you are stuck with the bill. It's the same
That's
kind of idea.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Too funny. Um, we talked about Azure in your time at Microsoft, as Azure became more and more a part of what people were really looking for. Um, and not just Azure, but the other cloud environments as well.
Mhm.
Could you describe, from your opinion, the options and limitations that people might need to think about as they look at cloud as an alternative?
Yeah, it definitely is a requirement depending on the agency and the level of security required. It's a requirement to have a higher level of certified environments that apply to that particular agency's needs. What's nice is that the cloud providers, whether it be Azure, AWS, GCP, even IBM Cloud, the cloud providers have stepped up to that challenge. And so you think of the need within a federal space for a government cloud. Well, that's fully available from Azure Government, from AWS GovCloud, or even higher levels of security. For example, that's needed by the CIA or the NSA. Those top secret clouds are fully available within AWS or Azure today. So yeah, definitely the cloud environment's been addressed. Even state and local government, those agencies that have to share information with other agencies, they have a level of requirements and certifications that are needed, and those certifications are pretty similar from one cloud provider to another.
That makes sense. And I know I'm bouncing around a little bit here, but I want to go back for a second. We talked about COVID before.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you feel also that one of the changes after COVID was that people didn't necessarily want to go back into the data center, and
Yeah.
more people are retiring now. What kind of impact has that been, where you can't just keep using the same technologies because the people who know those technologies are no longer there?
Yeah, Walter, you're absolutely referring to the Great Resignation that I think that we've all experienced. Not just in the commercial side, but also in the federal, state, and local government side. People deciding, well, hey, it's time. It's time to go ahead and retire. And in particular, for employees that have devoted their careers in the federal sector or state and local government. Fortunately, they are typically part of a federal employee retirement system or have a state pension. And so because of that level of guarantee as to what their income is going to be, and they're not depending on investments in the stock market necessarily, but because of that level of retirement funding that's going to be available to them, those employees are either deciding to retire now or will retire when they hit retirement age. And that's causing, within commercial sector, I hear of more and more employees that are still working beyond the retirement age because they love what they do, but also because their investments have taken a hit. But in the federal, state, and local government, again, that really isn't a factor. So that challenge then of people deciding to retire and then having the ability to retire and leaving the workforce is really causing a huge challenge with a skill shortage, not just for developers, but for operators and architects and DBAs. And another big challenge, this has been addressed in the commercial side, and that was addressed in the late 90s in preparation for Y2K, where a lot of large commercial customers went to offshore SIs to manage their application portfolio. But in the federal government, you can't do that. You've got to keep it onshore. So you really don't have that avenue to replace those retiring workers. The other thing I've seen is that some employees in federal and state and local retire, but then with the plan to supplement the retirement income by consulting back to the organizations they're retiring from. So that will delay the impact of full retirement, but only until those people finally say it's time. It's time to enjoy full-time retirement.
Absolutely. And I don't know about you, our experience has been that the tenure of these people in governmental agencies, they tend to have been there a long time.
Absolutely.
And so that's an awful lot of knowledge that ultimately will walk out the door and is so difficult to replace.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's not just the losing the skill; it's losing the knowledge of the applications and the workloads, because those tenured employees were the one that built it and supported those applications. Yeah, and that's actually so important when you think of bringing new kids in from college to join those organizations and support those applications. It's so important for the tenured employees to transfer the knowledge of those applications to the new employees coming in. But also it's a challenge, who coming out of college knows COBOL? Well, not too many. So moving into a modern language allows you to entice those new kids out of college that know Java or C#, to take on a workload for an agency. But in order to entice them, you need to move from the mainframe to those more modern languages.
Absolutely. Bob, I know we end up talking an awful lot about the IBM mainframe. I'm curious your perspective. There are, while not as many Unisys mainframes that are out there today as IBM Z series mainframes, do you feel that there's opportunity in the federal space for people who are running both IBM and Unisys?
Yeah, there certainly are, and you point out correctly the number of Unisys mainframes compared to IBM Z series mainframes. It's about 10% of the mainframes in the install base of customers. So the install base of Unisys mainframes is less, but still the target markets for Unisys was federal government, state and local government, and financial services. And so for that reason, even though there's less, this is still a large part of federal government, state and local government have a lot of Unisys mainframes in that space. And so, yeah, there's a huge opportunity to migrate, both the IBM standard Z series mainframe workloads, but also the Unisys mainframe workloads.
Absolutely. I'm going to flip back to development again and applications, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Do you feel that when people do look at moving from the mainframe, that they have the ability to be more agile and more responsive? Changing governmental regulations that can come up at the last moment. What's been your experience when you've talked to these agencies after they have started to move from the mainframe in terms of, were they more agile and more able to respond to those changes?
Yeah, certainly. And actually, this ties into several areas that we've talked about. So not only moving to a modern DevOps environment to manage and maintain these applications, support and enhance them, definitely accelerates that development process, and agencies have embraced that capability. You think of modern DevOps where you can roll out incremental changes on an ongoing basis versus a waterfall process where you have to wait until a major release in order to get changes into the system. The big challenge is that's difficult to do on the mainframe. Sure, you can move the development of COBOL into Eclipse or Visual Studio, and that helps. And there's capabilities to do that. But really embracing modern DevOps is much more useful for those customers writing Java or C#, and it's really integrated and supports that. One of the biggest challenges is you've got to have the support of the CIO, of the senior executives in the organization, because I've seen especially in federal agencies that a lot of the decisions are driven from the top down. So as an agency, perhaps the CIO changes, a senior executive moves from one agency to another, comes in with new ideas, new ways of doing things, then that will allow the agency to embrace this modern development, the DevOps processes, and take full advantage of moving these workloads off the mainframe.
Perfect. Bob, I know there was a project that Microsoft and Astadia got to work on together for the U.S. Air Force that we're all very proud of, obviously. Won a technology award within the Air Force for being able to move maintenance for their fighter aircraft, which was a really big deal in a mission critical application. Do you feel that that's the norm, that other organizations can, if the projects are run correctly and if they're working with people who have gone through this process before, that people can be or see achievable results just like that?
Yeah, they certainly can, and it's not just the results at the Air Force, and one that both of us were intimately involved in. At the Air Force, it wasn't just about reducing costs by getting that workload off the Unisys mainframe up into the cloud and having a more agile development environment as part of that process, but also the ability to take advantage of cloud services for analytics, machine learning, BI. And so you look at the ultimate benefits of doing this migration goes far beyond the initial look at those benefits of cost reduction and more agile development. Other agencies absolutely are looking at that Air Force success, both within the Air Force. Other projects are being looked at, as well as other agencies that are interested in replicating that success, and leveraging those capabilities within their own workloads.
That's interesting. I just asked you about replicatable results. I want to kind of go 180 degrees the other way right now, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Do you think there are any federal government agencies, environments, or applications that really just aren't suited for running anywhere other than the mainframe?
Yeah, there certainly are. And that's something that I know that you do such a great job at, and something I always strive for, was really listening to a customer and understanding their environment and not being afraid to tell them that, hey, a migration isn't what you want to do. This really doesn't apply to you. And so I think we always like to put the customers first and ensure that they make the right choices to be successful, whether they stay on the mainframe or move off the mainframe. And so the types of workloads that I've seen are problematic and a challenge, is that there are some workloads that, for security reasons, they require a private system with no outside connections.
Mm-hmm.
Those workloads, running on the mainframe in a data center, being isolated, could be, in a lot of cases, some cases, those workloads just need to stay on the mainframe. They're being successfully handling the needs of the agency or the business. Why not let them run? They're providing great value. Let them continue supporting the needs of that agency or the organization. Others really depend on the workload itself. And one that jumps out at me, and one that I worked on when I was back at Amdahl doing mainframe support, was TPF. So the transaction processing facility. Typically, you think of TPF as reservation systems like airline reservations, but it's also used for high levels of transaction, where you've got high volumes of transactions that need to be processed very, very quickly. So the IRS uses TPF, Amtrak uses TPF for the reservation system. And TPF, there's really no alternative, and there's not an easy way of migrating it. Sure, you can migrate the assembler or C# code, but you have to have the system that receives service requests and process those service requests from that custom code. So TPF is one that I avoid. Really, a rewrite is the only way. A replacement is the only way to deal with TPF. So yeah, there are some workloads like that, or there are some workloads like that it just doesn't make sense migrating off of them.
It makes sense. And like you, I run screaming scared whenever I hear it being mentioned, I must admit.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I have seen when we look at the infamous Gartner 5 or 6 R's, however many there are now, where replace is an option, looking to a COTS package.
Yeah.
Certainly in the commercial space, there are times where it just makes sense to go to a COTS package. At the federal level, my thought is that there really aren't as many options there. Perhaps at the state level, where you have agencies in every state where one can use something that another state has developed, then that's almost like a COTS package. But other than that, do you feel that in the federal space that you don't see COTS packages as an option as often?
Yeah, I absolutely see that. Definitely the COTS providers, in some cases, federal agencies will use COTS applications for a small part of their workloads. But thinking about moving from a custom application, set of custom applications, to a COTS package, makes good sense if there is a package available that doesn't need very much customization. If you need an exceeding amount of customization, then it's better to have a custom app. It's not cost effective to do that. So some workloads, it's more cost effective. If there's an application available to provide the services you need, it's more effective to move to that COTS package than it is to try to move or maintain that workload that you have. So replacing the functionality is sometimes better. And in state and local government, as you point out, there are some agencies, each state has a Department of Human Services. that has caseworkers, and social workers that go out and engage with the clientele. And there are some efforts that have taken place where COTS packages were created for Department of Human Services, even for unemployment. There's been some COTS package, and agencies have moved to the unemployment COTS package instead of using custom packages. So always look at that criteria. If a COTS package provides the capabilities you need with little customization, then it's good to put the onus on the vendor of that COTS package to maintain and enhance it, rather than build your own custom application or even migrate your own custom application.
That certainly makes sense. Bob, I'd like to ask you about testing. Obviously, testing is important in any mainframe migration or any project in general. Do you feel that there are any differences in public versus private sector and the way that testing occurs in each?
Yeah, and as you point out, as we well know, testing can be 50% of a migration project. Definitely less effort needs to be, or less time needs to be spent if there's test automation that's been implemented, more time if you don't have test automation. And the biggest challenge in public sector is the level of confidential information.
Yes.
A lot of times when you test an application, if a customer or agency has built an automated test process, they typically will have a test database that has obfuscated actual data. It doesn't have real data in it, but still reflects the type of data that needs to be done, but it needs to be processed by the application. If that's the case, then the testing can be provided and done by the vendor doing the migration. If the production data has to be used to do the testing and it's confidential information, in some cases, then the internal staff will have to perform that testing. So it really depends on the level of automation, and it depends on whether or not there's test data available, to fully test the sets of applications. So yeah, more staff time, internal staff time would be required if you don't have that test data fully available.
Absolutely. Well, Bob, unfortunately, it looks like we have come to the end of our time. I would like to ask, do you have any parting thoughts, any last thoughts that you might like to share, especially from local, state, federal government organizations who may be joining us today? Any words of wisdom to pass on to them?
Yeah, first of all, Walter, thank you so much for the opportunity. As usual, this is always a pleasure, spending time with you and sharing these kinds of thoughts. The parting thoughts, what I've seen, I left Microsoft in January, as you mentioned earlier, and I'm doing consulting now with a number of companies. And what I've seen is that there's been a dramatic increase of customer interest in mainframe modernization, mainframe migration, and it continues to grow every day. And part of it is, the advancements in the technologies with increased levels of automation has made it easier and more successful and lower cost to do these migrations. Part of it is the services provided are becoming more and more mature and less risk. And so that interest continues to grow. And it's been such a privilege working with Astadia because you've definitely have the technology, the people, and demonstrated success to be the logical choice as the service and migration partner for many companies, both in the federal government, commercial, and state and local government. So my hat's off to Astadia on the ability to address these needs of these customers. And definitely customers should not be concerned about having these conversations to see what opportunities there are for modernizing their mainframe workload.
Thank you very much, Bob. And as always, thank you for taking the time. I know our audience always enjoys when you get to join us on these podcast series because you do such a great job of sharing your experience and your wisdom.
My pleasure, Walter.
Again, as always, thank you.
Thank you.
And to everyone in the audience, thank you once again for taking the time to join us today. Please keep a lookout at www.astadia.com for our upcoming podcast, and we will look forward to seeing you then on the next one. Thank you all so much.